Hi. There was recently a discussion on Twitter about origShapes in Maya and what they are, why Maya needs them, and kind of how they fit into the whole rigging pipeline in Maya. So I figured in addition to that thread, we could go through and have a bit of a look at some practical examples of this. So let's first off just start out with a simple cube. I'm just going to delete history just to have a nice clean cube. Now, checking this, right, we have what we kind of expect here. We have our transform and we have our shape. Now, let me add a cluster to this. And let me just clear out this. Now, what you can see here now is that in addition to our transform and our shape that we had before, we now also have the org shape. That's basically because anytime that you have a shape, a mesh in Maya that doesn't have any inputs, it doesn't have any deformers on it. Um, as soon as you make a deformer on it, it will make an org shape. The org shape is a duplicate of your actual shape. Maya basically needs this so that it can figure out where it needs to put all the vertices, how the deformation math is going to go. Now, let us just move this up in one. So this is the thing. We move this cluster handle up one, but how does Maya know, or the deformers know that basically moving this cluster handle up one means that this vertex is here? Why isn't it here or here, right? Because that always comes based off the starting point, and the org shape is basically the starting point. So if you open up the attribute editor, you can actually see that we have the org shape here. Now, going under object display, you can see that intermediate object is ticked on. And that basically means that this is an object that won't show up in the outliner, it won't render. It's supposed to just be like a thing working in the background. Now, even as well, if we open up here and we look at shapes, there we can't see an extra shape here. But if we take this off, sorry, you can see we now actually end up with an extra cube here. And if I just close this and open it, you can now see that we have our org shape here. Now, if I select these, you can see that there are two different shapes happening here. So if I go back here, what I can do is I can go and I can select these. Notice here now that you get these kind of like these extra vertices here selected as well. I'm not entirely sure why that's happening, but it's something that can happen as soon as you have kind of connected shapes like this, because you're kind of messing about with the order or the hierarchy, kind of how Maya deals with these things. So to fix it, just kind of select them again. It's something that usually happens as like the first one, so it kind of gets a bit confused and selects these as well. So now we can see here is basically if we change and move these around, what we're doing is we're changing the starting point for where these vertices actually are. Now, if I just do like a quick locator here, I snap that there, and I do one here as well. And if I just parent it underneath here, you can see that the translation here is 1, which is exactly what we're expecting the cluster to move it from. So you can see when we turn the cluster off, it will go back to this shape that we're doing. But if we turn it on, it will move 1 unit up. So if we take this back, boom, it snaps into here. That's the basic idea of this. You basically need your starting point, because the only thing that the cluster handler is doing is saying, I want to add 1 to this. But the question is, what are you adding one to? Where are you starting from? And that's where the org shape comes in. Now, let's have a look at how we can actually use this for something a bit more interesting. I've got a character here that's just very quickly skinned up. I haven't even touched the weights. Um, Now, what I have done is I've added in a delta mesh here as well. So what we have is we got a skin cluster and we got a delta mesh with a couple of weights here. So you can see I've gone in and painted the weights. Now imagine your modeler, your client, whoever comes and says, okay, this shape here, no, we don't want this. We want this instead. We want this snowman abomination thing here, right? Now, if you were to go in and do a copy, you could do a copy weights, you could do a copy all over in world space on this, but you might end up having to like kind of clean up in like some areas, like I don't know, the fingers might get like really close, and the armpits and stuff like that. And you might just not, if you've done a lot of custom rigging on this, which you haven't scripted, you might have like a really bad time updating all this. Now, this is where we can actually just go in and change the org shape. So if I've just got these guys selected, open up the node editor, and I add them in here. Oh man, I miss Linux. Cool. So what we have here is that's our final shape, right? So we're not going to do anything to that, so we can just get rid of that. We've got a new shape, the org shape for the new shape. So we're not going to need that anyway because I've got deformers on here. The only thing that we really need that we want is the final shape of new shape. Okay, that's actually a really bad name. Um, uh, Updated. I'll just call it that. So we just want the final one. That's the one that has like all the inputs on this, and we want to connect that into the org shape of our human body. So if I open up this, and what we want to do is we want to do the out mesh, and we basically want to connect that into our in mesh. So if I just move this over here, you can now see that if I do my out mesh to in mesh, boom, this now updates and got a bit more chubby, right? So because we still have that as a live connection, I can still go in on this guy and I can still actually tweak this, right? So I could go all crazy on this because these two are now linked. And because I'm updating the org shape, the starting point, all the deformation that I had here is still here. It's still valid, right? I can even go in here and if I check my delta mesh weights, they're still all there, right? I might of course have to go in and tweak the weights depending on how big the model changes, but haven't lost any data, I haven't lost any information. Now, if you can keep this live, or you can just select it and do press delete to get rid of that, and now this won't impact this anymore. You can still delete this. So that's often how I would do it if I just need to do a really quick model update. I would import in the new model. I would just connect that to my org shape, delete the connection, delete the model that I imported, and boom, I'm done. Now, we're pretty much done here now for that. One thing to kind of know about this is that it's often very common to see multiple org shapes pop up. So let's have a quick look at why that's happening. Right, so basically this is what we have now. We've got our transform, and our transform has our transform has our body shape, which is the final one, which has all the deformers, and we will have our org shape. Now, this, let me just double check. This should say that it's connecting out to them. Let's just double check. Yeah, so you can actually see that. I'm not sure why that's not showing up here now, but it should actually show up all the outputs that it's going into, so that it's going into tweak to. This is something to be aware of as well, that normally, if I just clear this, if you grab, for instance, like a shape, you always get like, oh, cool, here's all the inputs. Um, sorry. Oh, is it because it's going into the delta mesh? That's interesting. I haven't seen that before. That kind of caught me off guard. Sorry about that. Um, but basically, oftentimes, if you know what, let's just do our cube again. So I'll do a cube. I'll delete this, and I'll just do a cluster on it. And now I've got these here. So you can see now when I select this, it will actually show me the outputs. But if I go and actually graph it, oftentimes you won't actually see an output coming from here. That's usually because you've got auxiliary nodes off. So if you turn that on, you can actually see that it's going into this group parts node and then into the tweak. So just a quick heads up on that if you get a bit confused as to like why it's not actually showing up anything. Now, back to why you can get multiple kind of shapes. So a very typical thing is you might have something here and then you're like, cool, I need a duplicate version of this. You duplicate it out, and what happens is that Maya will duplicate the transform with all of the shapes that are there. So that basically means that you now have your kind of final shape and the org shape. And if we now go and take this and we add a new cluster, and let's just add this again, you can now see that we've actually gotten an extra org shape here. So we actually have two org shapes now. This one outputs nothing, and this one outputs to the tweak. And that's just going to keep, kind of going around and messing like that. So if we go here and we duplicate that, that all has all of those, add a cluster, and we add that, and now you can see we now have 4 of these. Oh, sorry, 3. And this is a bit of an issue, especially if you have a very high poly mesh, because each of these are actually saves like a full copy of the mesh. You can run into getting very large file sizes and having very kind of slow loading times. Probably won't see it here too much, but if I just say test, and if I go and I just do my document, do Maya projects, default scenes. So if we have a look at this guy, so currently test is 74 kilobytes, but let me just go and get rid of the, okay, so I don't need that, I don't need that, I don't need that, I will need that. Let's just double check that. Cool. So if I now save this, right, so before it was 74 kilobytes, and now you can see it's only 70 kilobytes now, but the larger the mesh, the larger the file savings, right? So especially if you have a human or anything else, watch out for kind of stray org shapes like this, because it can really add a lot to your file size. And just to, let's just open up the human again. So if I just duplicate this a couple of times, I'll do a cluster. So if I save this, we can see that the human is 6.9. And if I go in, I'll get rid of this org shape. it's now down to 5.6. So you can see, of course, larger the data that you store in there, the larger the file saving. Sorry. Now, what we've looked at so far is only dealing with um, updating a shape that has the same vertex count and the same vertex order. If I was to um, change anything on this would be completely broken because of it has per vertex skin data. But you can actually have a bit more fun with this if you're using deformers such as like nonlinears or lattice. So here we just got a cluster and I've just got a lattice underneath that. So I move it, all that stuff, and I can modify this, right? So what I've done here is I've added in a choice node where basically I can go from my sphere to this tetra, uh, the platonic solid, and then also to my torus without with the exact same deformation as if I was right. I can still go in here now and I can move this and I can go back and I can jump between these. So this is something that this kind of shape manipulation allows you to do because of um, it's just reading up like the whole thing. We're not relying on the pure kind of vertex weights and stuff like this. So we can allow us to do this. This will also work with the cluster, as you can see, because it just moves the whole thing. So let's have a quick look at how this is actually set up. So let me just graph this up a bit bigger. I can just get rid of that. So what you can see here is I've basically got my normal sphere shape, I've got my platonic, and I've got my torus, and they just go into a choice node, and then I literally pipe the output of that straight into the origShape of my, like, what was originally my sphere. So I just made, the lattice, the cluster, all of these setups, and then I just added in this choice node and connected it into my shape org. And because the choice node can just push through any data that you're pretty much putting into it, I can go in and select which input of my shapes that I want. So that's pretty fun. This one thing that you have to watch out for is like I said, with the actual painting of the vertices. So let's say that if I go in here and I paint, let me just get rid of the lattice. Actually, it'll be a bit easier to do without that. So if I go in and actually paint my cluster weight, right? Let's say that I did something like that. If I now go between these shapes, you can see my weights are completely messed up because of it. Because we've done is we've basically taken the vertices that we have here, those indices, and we've painted black to those. So you can see here as well, it's starting to freak out. But if I go in here and if I start to just paint back here, so you can see that, and this is why you can't really deal with kind of deformers that require weighting in Maya. You'd have to have a way of updating that, which starts to become like very finicky. Cool. So let's look at one final fun thing, which was something we talked about. Oh, sorry, that was wrong file. In the thread, and that was basically what if you have, oops, cool, I had accidentally messed up my file, so I just had to recreate that really quickly. So imagine we basically want to have, sorry, So sorry about that. Imagine that we have our kind of base full body human, and we want to separate this out into head and body cutouts, but we want them to be kind of linked. Well, a typical way of doing that would potentially be do something like having like cutting off the head and then having like a transfer attribute so that they would kind of stay together, or wrapping them, or something like that. But we can actually use the delete component node to do this for us and kind of pushing through these shapes. So I've got a bit of code that, let me just run this. So you can see there, basically I went from having cubes to now having parts of this mesh. These are the individual kind of meshes here. Let me just do these so that they're right on top of each other. Oh boy, sorry. Um, you can see here they have inputs, a delete component node in here, and I can now go and here you can see that thing that I was mentioning earlier as well with this kind of popping up. Make sure that you just delete and kind of click off something. So you can see now I can move the vertices on this, and these two, still two completely separate meshes, are updating perfectly with that. This can be really, really useful for if you have a lot of kind of cutouts, which in more kind of advanced rigs you might have a lot of these. So I would really recommend having basically just these in kind of a group where you just say like these are my base meshes, and then you would kind of duplicate off from those. You could even use these to kind of push into the org shapes of other kind of duplicated meshes that you have of this, so that you always make sure that these are always kind of up to date with the correct ones. Now, what is the code actually doing? If we have a quick look here, um, I'll just turn off auxiliary nodes quickly. Sorry. So what's actually happening is that just doing the same as before, taking the out mesh and I'm piping that into the input geometry of each of these delete component nodes, and then I'm taking the output geometry of that and pushing that into the org shape. You could just push this directly into the shape. You wouldn't be able to kind of modify or tweak it then, because it would be kind of locked to it. You wouldn't have a tweak shape. Sorry, a tweak node, so you wouldn't be able to currently now, because of how I set this up. The delete component feeds into a tweak, so that I can still go in here and do things to this if I want to. I probably don't want to do that for kind of these main base meshes. I want to keep them very nice and clean, but you could do that. So let's have a quick look at the code for this. So I'm using PyML for this just because it's a bit nicer and cleaner. So basically what I have is I've just got some body parts, which is basically just a reference to the head and body meshes. And then I've got a couple of lists where I've just selected all the faces that I want to, basically these are all the faces that I need to delete to create the head. And these are all the faces that I need to delete to create the body. And I've also just added them into their own kind of like list here as well, just so I can kind of easily loop through it. So I'm basically just looping through this. Let me just scale this up a bit. And just getting the body parts, I'm getting the correct transform. And I'm getting also the correct delete list. And here I'm just kind of cleaning up this a bit. I'm getting rid of the base, because what we want to do here is we want to make up a component list. This component list we want to set on the delete component node. And a component list will only have, for faces, it will just only be f here. So let me actually just print this out so you can see. Component list. I'm just gonna do error after this so we don't see the whole thing. So if I just do that. So you can now see this is basically the list that you would end up with. Um, to make a component list, you actually need to first provide it with how many actual data entries you have. So how many of these that we're passing in here. So to do that, I'm just doing a length of that full list, and then I'm just extending it with that list as well, so that I just get this kind of nice clean thing. Um, then I'm just creating my delete node. I'm taking the base, so that's the original body, right? And connecting the out mesh of that into the input geometry, just as we were looking at in here, right? Base mesh, output, input geometry, and I'm basically just getting delete node and I'm pushing that straight into the input mesh, like I said that you could just do. And then I select the delete component. Um, this would be pretty much everything that you would need to do. If you want to have that tweak node, then I would recommend doing what I do here, where I basically just do a cluster. So I just add a cluster to it, and then I basically get the sorry, the tweak node that's created with that cluster, and then I just make sure that I add the tweak node into the in mesh, so that because the that way I will bypass the actual cluster deformation, and then I just delete the cluster afterwards, so that we will now have our this is basically what we'll have. So if I just show auxiliary nodes on this, we should see. Oh yeah, sorry. So it will actually push into here. So all of that code this is pretty much what you need to do. Cool. I hope that's been useful and kind of explained a bit better of the org shape in Maya and how you can kind of manipulate and use it to your advantage. Um, it's something that's been really, really useful in a lot of rigs that I've done. And especially if you do get into that point where you end up with a lot of duplicate meshes because you have a lot of kind of rig systems that need duplicate meshes and kind of like separating out deformations like that. Um, this is really, really useful. If you've got any questions or anything, let me know. Cool. Thanks.